Dr. Peter Sexton is our next speaker, and Pete has a lot of experience over the years looking at soil health and regenerative ag. He was actually my master's advisor, so I have to be really careful, I feel like. You always, it's kind of like your high school teachers, you always call them Mr. or Mrs. someone, so I have to be pretty careful around Dr. Sexton. He is well experienced. He has many years of work at the Southeast Research Farm. He's the manager there and has been since 2012. He does work with cover crops to improve soil quality, forages, grazing. A lot of livestock integration work goes on at the farm, which is near Beersford. And also, of course, row crop work, corn, soybean, ways to be profitable, but also while preserving soil health. There's a lot of no-till and cover crops grown at our Southeast Experiment Station that are not necessarily a large part of all of our research farms. They're pretty unique in that they raise livestock and integrate it in with a lot of the research that goes on there, which is very practical. So his past experience is kind of interesting. Peter has worked as an agronomist in the potato program for the University of Maine. He's been a faculty researcher with Oregon State University, and his postdoc work was on soybean physiology at Iowa State. And most interestingly, I think, he was a volunteer agronomist in a technical assistance program with the Mennonite Central community in Bangladesh. So Pete's very worldly, has a lot of experience, and I think today he's going to bring you a really interesting presentation that hopefully you can apply on your operation or with your business. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Peter.
Thanks, Sarah. Okay, well, Sarah was a very good graduate student, so it's easy to do a good job when you have good graduate students. So, that said, we're going to talk about work with no-till cover crops and rye. I'm going to move right along. There's a lot of data, so kind of fasten your seat belts, and then hopefully we'll have some time for questions at the end. And if you got a really burning question, raise your hand and we'll stop and visit about it. Okay, before I go too far, I need to acknowledge the crew at the Southeast Farm. There's Gerald Williamson. He's kind of the elder statesman there. He's our keeps things running and works as a technician. Scott Bird manages the feedlot. Ruth Stevens keeps the whole farm organized and keeps us all on track. That's Ashley Colford. She worked for us a couple summers. Jocelyn Forsett, she's a horticulturist, just hired on. Brad Rops is operations manager and keeps us moving along. And Gretchen Quinga works in a high tunnel, and that's me. So I got to acknowledge whatever good work we're doing. Of course, everything's dependent on the good Lord's help, but we've also got a good crew. Okay, this is a Southeast Farm here, kind of a satellite view. I'm going to talk about some no-till work initially, and that's in this set of plots here. So we're in these 3 quarters, and these plots are 60 feet wide by 300 feet long, and it was started by Dale Sorensen, and there's plus and minus tillage, and then there's 2, 3, and 4 year crop rotation. So 2 years corn, soybean, 3 years is corn, soybeans, oats, 4 years is corn, soybean, oat. Right now it's winter rye. So that's the no-till data I'm going to talk about comes from that set of plots there, and that's been in place since 1991. And just a really quick look at tilled and no-till. Basically, people doing the tillage so they can warm the soil up faster in the spring, helps them a bit with weed control, for disease control, gets rid of some stover, and the nutrients break down faster. Of course, it's more prone to erosion, and it breaks up the mycorrhizal fungi and destroys a lot of the microbial community. In the no-till, we have less cost, we have better soil structure, conserves moisture, it favors these positive microbial associations, especially mycorrhizal fungi, and of course it protects the soil from erosion because we keep cover on it. Looking at the temperature part of it a little bit, this is just an example. On the bottom, we're looking at May, June, July, August, September, and then this is the no-till minus conventional till. So if it's 0, they're the same. If it's negative, that means the no-till's cooler. If it's positive, it means the no-till's warmer. So what it starts out is initially, May into early June, we're on average about 2 degrees cooler in our no-till soil than in the tilled soil. And it comes out to about 2 to 3 days relative maturity, if you calculate it out as for corn on a relative maturity index. Later in the season, it's actually a little warmer in the soil, and I think that's because there's more microbial activity going on here. But initially, it is a little cooler. In terms of physical structure, this is just shows this visually. These two plots are side by side. So this plot here is right there, and this plot here is right there. So these are side by side plots. This is in 2019, and these tracks are from a fertilizer spreader. Brad almost got stuck there. He got through it. Probably should have waited for another day, but there we go. But the point I want to make here is see all the water ponded on the surface? That's because of your poor structure. The rain has broken up the soil, it's crusted, the water's not going into the ground where you need it, and also because of the poor structure, it doesn't hold equipment up. This same plot right next to it, same amount of rainfall, there's no standing water. And if you look close, you can see the tracks, but they're hard to see. And it's just because the better physical structure holds up traffic better. And what we find is that, yes, the no-till soils are a little cooler and moister in the spring, but actually after a rain, we can get in and plant and spray faster and less time on the no-till ground than on the tilled ground because it just doesn't have the structure to hold up the equipment. Another factor is the soil moisture. These are from some soil moisture probes, just another example set of data. The black line is the tilled ground, and the red line is no-till neighboring plot. This axis is volumetric soil moisture, so 0.33 here would be 33%. So this is a fraction of the soil volume that holds water. And we can see here that when we get into, well, you can't quite see the bottom here, but this is in July and August. So initially in the spring, everything's wet. This is at 12-inch depth. Then once we get into our July and August period, this was in 2017, you can see the tilled soil didn't have nearly as much moisture as the no-till because it wasn't covered, and also you don't have as good infiltration when it first comes in. So we're conserving moisture for when we need it during grain filling, and we have better soil structure, and that better soil structure helps the microbial life, and it's also a function of the microbial life. So it's kind of a positive cycle. Once we get going in a positive direction, we improve the soil, it becomes a better environment for the microbes, and the microbes further improve the soil. Okay, so we're going to look at some yield data. We're going to start with corn. This is corn yield on this on the y-axis. This is the years in the trial, so it starts in 91. This is last year. And you can see there's a lot of year-to-year variability. I put some stars up here in the years where there was significant difference. So a black star means the tilled plots did better, and a red star means the no-till did significantly better. So basically it's 5 and 5. We had 5 years out of those, about approximately 30 years, where the no-till was significantly better than the tilled, and 5 years where the tilled was better. These last 2 years where we had drought, we had about 21 bushel better yield in the no-till plots this year, and about 16 bushel better last year. So in the dry years, the no-till really shines. But there was significant interaction, and there was interaction with rotation. So to pull this data apart a little bit, and this graph looks at 2, 3, and 4 year rotations. The blue bar is the tilled plot, and the yellow bar is no-till. And basically, in a 2 year rotation, the tilled averaged 5 bushel per acre better than the no-till. So this is about 150 versus 145. In the 3-year rotation, they're the same statistically. We can't separate them. In a 4-year rotation, the no-till outperforms the tilled by about 5 bushel per acre. So this is like 161, and that's like 156. So the longer we make our rotation, the stronger the benefit for the no-till. So the tilled soil doesn't care as much if it gets a good rotation or not. But you can see the no-till picked up here roughly 16, 17 bushel per acre across this range, whereas the tilled picked up about 5 bushel per acre, going from 2, 3 to 4-year rotation. So rotation is really important in a no-till system, and if you can diversify your rotation, you'll see a bigger kick in your yield than your neighbor that tills would. Okay, soybeans. Similar kind of graph. We got soybean yield over here versus the year of the trial. This time we've got, I think, 11 years where the no-till out-yielded the tilled, and I think 4 years where the tilled did better than the no-till. This last year, we were about 7 bushel per acre better in the no-till, and the year before that we were about 10 bushel per acre improvement with no-till. So soybeans, the no-till system very much favors yield over time. Of course, year to year there's variability, but if we take the average across 29 years, the tilled yielded 45 bushel per acre and the no-till yielded 46.9, and that difference is statistically significant. If you run the stats on it, it's 1.8 bushel per acre, and that is different. We can say that that was statistically valid. And another way to analyze this is it's a different way to crunch the numbers, but I want to take another look at it. I did this a couple years ago, and it's called a stepwise regression analysis. And I did a little bit of work with Ruben Benke on campus, and we put together monthly data on temperature, growing degree days, stress degree days, rainfall, evapotranspiration, moisture deficit, and we put in tillage and rotation, and we plug all those numbers in the computer, and then the computer has a way of sorting them out and deciding which are the strongest factors. And it comes back and tells you, the first one that comes back is the strongest factor, which in this case is stress in July, August, September, which stands to reason. So if you have high temperatures, shortens your filling period. That was the biggest determinant of yield across those 29 years. And then precipitation, and evapotranspiration is tied into that. But interestingly, the computer pulled out tillage, and it predicted minus 2.4 bushel per acre effect from tillage. So we kind of crunched the numbers two different ways. This is just looking at averages, and then this is looking at a stepwise regression, which is supposed to be a little more predictive. And they're both saying the soybeans, we lose about 2 bushel an acre with tillage. So the corn is kind of a wash, and particularly if you're in a short rotation, with the soybeans, we can say there was a yield advantage on the order of 2 bushel more or less. And I think the main thing we're gaining with the no-till is the savings on cost. So this is just some data from University of Minnesota Extension. A fellow that puts this together every few years is Lazarus. He's a extension ag engineer, so you can pull this offline if you want. And his estimates, chisel plows about $18 an acre cost, tandem disc $18, field cultivator about $9. And then ownership of a tractor, just to own it, a 200 horsepower tractor, he figures $12,000 just to own it, and $37 per hour of use depreciation, and with 500 hours of use, roughly $59,000. So I think the real gain with the no-till system, in a dry year you will get better yield, but in a wet year you might not, or you might even lose just a little bit relative to the tilled outfit. But I think the real angle on it is the return on investment and not needing as much equipment, fuel, labor to get the job done. So if you're thinking about going to no-till, I would say a few points that I would consider. One is, you want to make sure you've got good distribution of residue behind your combine, so your planter can get through it the next spring all right. You're going to need about 30 pounds of extra nitrogen on your corn for the first few years, because you're building soil organic matter, and it takes a little while for the microbial system and all to kick in. So we do recommend a little extra nitrogen initially on corn in a no-till system. Got to make sure your planter's set right. You may end up with more winter annuals in your weed population, and that's manageable. You just want to be aware of it, that might happen. So if you're awake and you're aware of it, you can scout for it and you can deal with it, and it won't surprise you. There's kind of a divided jury on whether you need to ban fertilizer. Dwayne Beck will tell you very strongly that you need to ban it. Other people will say it doesn't matter. So I can't really say a lot about that. I think we haven't seen a response to banning fertilizer. We've only done 1 or 2 trials with it. So we'll probably do more with that in the future. If you're set up for it, though, you probably want to do that. And that last point is crop diversification is really going to be more valuable for you in a no-till system than in a tilled system. And I would say you probably, if you're in the situation where you're thinking of transitioning to no-till, I would say at least start with a small field. Maybe you want to do your whole farm. I mean, it's up, but even if you're on the fence, I would say start with a small field and work through it till you get figured out how you're going to set your planter until you're comfortable with it, and then expand it. And it's going to take a while for that microbial community to adapt to the new conditions. It's just like if you have a forest fire, you don't come back next year and there's a forest there, right? If you have a forest fire, you come through and it takes time for that ecosystem to redevelop. It's the same thing with tillage. You come through with tillage, it destroys everything. Well, you go to no-till next year, it doesn't mean the microbial system's all there. It's going to take 4, 5, 6 years for that to recover. So you have to keep that in mind if you're in that situation, that for the first few years, you're going to be a little bit uphill. And that's why we recommend a little extra nitrogen initially. Okay, so I'm going to change gears, talk about cover crops. Where's Sarah? How much time do I have, Sarah? 25 minutes. Okay, so we're going to, well, any questions on the no-till there, or? Okay, yeah.
On the April 5th picture that you had there, the 2 side-by-side there with the wheel ruts in the one.
Yeah.
I'm assuming there was no frost left in the ground at that point?
I don't think so. That would have been 2019. Both those plots were going to be seeded to oats, and we were putting down about 80 pounds of nitrogen. But so that's kind of the history there. But that's not, I mean, 2019 was unique as it was a really wet year. We had a lot of rain in 2018, and then we hit 2019, so we started with moisture and got more. So that's kind of an extreme example, but we see that real frequently, where we have tilled and no-till plots next to each other, and you can, if you're spraying or something, you can go in and spray in the no-till plot, but you better stay out of the tilled one, because you'll just bury your equipment. So there's a real striking difference in the physical structure and the trafficability of the soil. And that goes back to the things Chris Nichols was talking about yesterday, where the microbial communities and the glomalin and the byproducts that those microbes are producing benefit the soil, and they benefit the soil structure. So it's like mortar between bricks. It holds the soil and has a better structure than if you don't have that, and it's just kind of loose and doesn't hold any weight up.
Pete,
Yeah.
what's the difference in organic matter between the long-term no-till and the till?
I don't have those numbers on me, I'm sorry. The organic matter is higher in the no-till, but I can't remember it right offhand. Sorry about that. Yeah.
One of the things about no-till is it keeps the ground cooler. A problem in the spring when you want to plant, a real advantage in the summer when it's hot. Why wasn't your no-till soil cooler in July?
Okay, that's a good, interesting question. So the question was here. Okay. So this is showing the no-till soil is a little cooler. You kind of got a lot of bounce there, but most of the points are right here. These are hourly data points, so they bounce all around. But on average, about 2 degrees cooler. If you average all those points, it's about -2. And then in July, August, in here, it's just slightly warmer. So what's happened here is right in this area, these plots canopied. So the conventional tilled is now shaded, just like the tilled. But the tilled is a little warmer, I think, because you have more microbial activity, right? It's just like you get a bunch of people in a room and they heat the room up, right? Because their energy in their body, they're respiring, or you got a bunch of cattle in the barn, they heat the barn up. And a similar thing, these microbes are respiring, and not all the energy they use goes into their growth. Some of it's lost as heat. So I think my hypothesis is this being slightly warmer here is because the soil's more active in the no-till system. This system where you tilled, you destroyed all the residue, you incorporated it, and you would have had a flush of activity, right, with the spring tillage, right, and then it's done. Whereas this is even and more sustained through the growing season. So I think that's what's going on there. Okay, in the interest of time, I better move on. Okay, so I'm just going to share some of our experiences with cover crops. We've done a number of trials where we look at mostly brassica, radish, turnip, and then some peas and lentils versus mixes that are dominantly grasses. And we're just going to look at short-term effects on corn yield. And I think of a lot of angles on selecting cover crop species, and I'm sure there's more if a person thinks about it, but I've thought of 7 dominant ones. First one is how easy it establishes and how competitive it is. Second is the temperature adaptation. If it likes heat, if it's like sorghum Sudan grass, that's great in July. If you're planting in the middle of August, you probably want something that's going to grow under cooler conditions. So you got to match your selection to the temperature of your growth environment that you're anticipating. Another factor is residue, whether you want it. Then you want things with high fiber. If you don't want residue, you want things with low fiber that break down quickly. So there's big differences in cover crops and how long the residue persists. Interactions with the following crop, especially moisture. If you're in a moisture limiting situation, you really have to think twice about what you use for a cover crop and how long you let it run. Pathogens are another thing. You don't want to carry pathogens over. Livestock, if you're going to graze it, then you want more grasses in the mix, and then just how it fits in your cropping pattern and the cost. So this is just an example of ease of establishment. This is crimson clover. It's very slow to establish. It takes a long time to get going. This was planted in some plots. The volunteer oats weren't controlled, and you just got oats there. You can't see the clover. This dwarf Essex, just same trial, same year, in small plots, and you can see that the dwarf Essex could compete. So this is an example of something that establishes quickly and is competitive, and that's really what you want. Temperature adaptation, this mixture back to here, these are these brassicas. They're going to grow late into the year. This means they're going to use moisture into November, but they're going to put on growth once it gets cold. This is a mixture. These are millets here that got frost killed, blended with some grasses. So initially, the millets grew well, and then they got killed, and then the oats, and there's a small percentage of radish and turnip in there that are still growing. So that's just another factor to consider when you want it to kill early or not. Maybe you want it to die early so it doesn't use moisture, then you might want something with a lot of millets and cowpeas. As soon as you have a frost, it's dead. But if you want to graze cattle on it and you're looking for some forage in November, you want something that'll be frost tolerant. Okay, this graph shows some yield data with broadleaf versus grass cover crops. And we've got wet years and dry years. So on this side, we've got the season where there's a broadleaf mix, which is mostly radish, turnip, peas, or grass mix, which is oats, barley, millets, and Sudan. And then this is the rainfall from the crop year, which I start in September and end the next August. And if we look here, on average, the yield of the following corn crop was 4.4 bushel per acre better with the broadleaf and about same amount negative with the grass. In wet years, which would be in here 2014, 15, 16, and 2020, we averaged 9.2 bushel per acre better yield in the corn following the broadleaf cover crop and minus 2.6 following a grass cover crop. In a dry year, we lost average minus 2 bushel per acre with the brassica and minus 6.9 with the grass, And these last 2 years particularly very dry. We lost about 10 bushel per acre in 2021 and 7 bushel per acre this last year where we had a broadleaf cover crop mix. So the difference here and here is moisture. This was the first year I took over the farm and we started going no-till, and I think in this situation maybe that particular field was in tough shape and the cover crop helped it out even though it was a moisture stress. So this is a little bit anomalous. This would be more typical that we would expect in a more mature system. And so when we had good moisture, we picked up, roughly 9-10 bushel per acre from that broadleaf cover crop mix. When we had last 2 years drought, we lost about 8 bushel per acre on average. So the moisture is a big factor that you have to consider, and that's going to vary from year to year and place to place. So if you're further east of us, this is less of a concern. And further west, if you're in an environment where you're generally short of moisture, then you have to think about this more. So this is a short-term response. So this is just looking at 1 year, not looking at multiple years. We have another trial in the rotation study. We've split plots with and without a cover crop, and that's been going since 2013. And in those places, we don't see this, even in a dry year, we see it's a wash. So in a long-term sense, having the cover crop year after year after year after year, you accumulate a benefit, and we don't see the yield loss with it. So if you really, so this is just 1 year cover crop scenario here. I think for what my take on it and my interpretation would be, if you're in a good moisture environment, go for the cover crop. If you're in a dry year, you might want to skip it unless you need it for forage. But the cover crop overall will improve your drought resistance in the long run, not initially, but in the long run. So if I do cover crop every year for 5 years, then that plot is going to be more drought resistant than where I didn't. Okay, looking at decomposition and residue, this is NDF, so neutral detergent fiber on this axis. There's a lot of funky math that goes into this. I won't go into that, but this is basically your resistance to decomposition. And we did a mesh bag study. We put different materials out and measured how fast they decayed. Kale, which is like a brassica, broke down very quickly. Grass hay, old straw, wood shavings, didn't break down hardly at all, practically zero breakdown. But the point is, more fiber, more resistance to decay. So if you want something that's going to break down quickly, you want to choose things that are low fiber. If you want things that are going to persist, you're looking for high fiber cover crops. This just shows you the range here. This is crude fiber and this is crude protein. I put potatoes in there because I used to work with potatoes. 2% fiber, 10% protein. I don't know if you've ever, any potato farmers here, but you get a pile of potatoes that's 10 feet high and it starts to rot, it's gone really fast. It's amazing how fast they disappear. You got low fiber, high protein. They just break down. Turnips, dwarf Essex, cowpeas, these things are about the same amount of fiber as protein. They're going to break down. They're going to disappear. You start to get out here, wheat, hay, sorghum, Sudan. Now you're talking high fiber, low protein. That's going to take the microbes longer to break that down. So you just want to think about that, whether you want residue or not, and then that's should influence your decision on what you put in the mix. As a forage, this is some data from some work we did probably 8-9 years ago now. We measured average daily gain. This was with Elaine Grings and some other folks at the Southeast Farm, and we had different cover crop mixes, and just the way between the volunteers that came and the mix, what was in the mix, this first one was 31%, these were 80, these are 96% grass. So you can see as we get more grass, we tend to get better gain on the cattle. So those brassicas are great and they test high for nutrition, but they don't have much fiber. And I think that high moisture limits cattle intake. So if you're grazing, in a grazing situation, if you're gunning for good average daily gain, you want to have more grasses in the mix. And we like forage sorghum and Sudan grass, but you do have to think about prussic acid with those. So just kind of to sum this up quick, blends tend to be better than single species, especially because your single species, if it's susceptible to disease or some environmental stress, you might not have much growth, whereas if you have a blend where one fails, another will fill in. You want things that are quick to establish and differ from the next crop so that you don't carry diseases, and weight it towards what temperatures you're going to have during the growth period. The composition with fiber matters, so more fiber means more residue. We tend to do better at Beersford. The corn does better following a cool season broadleaf mix, but that's provided we have moisture. We haven't seen an effect on nitrogen requirements for the following crop. So we haven't seen that the cover crop spared us nitrogen. So now switching gears and talking about rye. I'm going to talk about rye as a forage crop first. We get about 1,500 to 4,700 pounds dry matter, usually 2,000 to 3,000 pounds per acre. And that's when we just raise the rye as a cover crop, low input, plant it when the corn comes off. If we plant it early and fertilize it, we'll get about twice that. And we need to think about the later burn down. Means that the rye is going to put on more biomass, but also means that it's going to use more water. This is from some forage trials. We've got wheat, triticale, rye, and you can see the rye greens up faster, and it produces more biomass. We've done these trials for 4 years, and the rye always outperforms the forage wheats, and 3 out of 4 years it'll outperform the triticale. These are some data slides, and we're short of time, but I want to point out this open pollinated line Hazlitt is statistically always close to among the top yielders in every year. The one thing we have to think about with rye in terms of its biomass, whether you're managing for a cover crop or not, is it grows really fast in May. So this is about 1,300 pounds in the middle of May. It's about 3,200 pounds in June. So it's about more than doubled its growth, about 2.5 times the growth in 2 weeks. This is some other data from 2019 from Ben Brockmuller master's thesis. So this rye at the beginning of May was about 300 pounds per acre. Out here at the end of May, it was about just about 2,500 pounds per acre. So about an 8-fold increase in biomass during May. So the rye grows really fast in May. So you have to manage that. You know, if you want that, that's great. If you don't, you need to kill it early. But just be aware that it's going to grow really fast. Once you get from mid-May on, it takes off. And while it's taking off, it's using water. So this graph is, the black line is fallow, the red line is soil moisture under a rye crop. And I just want to point out, early May, they're the same. The rye hasn't used much water. As you get into May, it uses more moisture. So out here by early June, you've lost about 2 inches of moisture underneath that rye. So if you're in a situation where moisture is critical, and the rye is just a cover crop, you don't want to see this happen. If you're in a situation where you want the rye for forage, then that's maybe a sacrifice you're willing to make. So it's going to vary for each person and their situation and what their goals are, but you want to be aware that it's going to use a lot of moisture in May. And it also is going to take up quite a bit of potash. So this is with a cover crop, 72 pounds per acre, potash in the rye, with high end, meaning high seed rate, fertilized, planted early. That's going to go up to about 170 pounds of potash in the rye. And so now if you take that rye off as hay or silage, you took a lot of potash out of the system, which is a bad combination if you're in a drought, because under drought stress, crops need more potash. So just got to think about that. If you're gonna take it for hay or silage, you need to make sure you got plenty of potash in the system. And I probably just got a minute or two left, huh? All right, so we'll try to zip right along. Your forage quality goes down rapidly. This graph is your carbon to nitrogen ratio, so it goes up rapidly as the crop grows. The carbon to nitrogen ratio goes up, so it's going to break down slower. So the crop that you let go and put on biomass is going to persist longer than the one that you killed earlier. So it's kind of a multiplicative effect. The later you let it go, the more biomass there is, the slower it's going to break down. Both of those are happening. And it all depends whether you want that residue or not, and whether it's using moisture that you wanted for the next crop or not. And I'm just going to zip through this, but we did some grazing work in the spring, and through lack of resources, we haven't been able to repeat this much, but we didn't see any effect on the yield of the following soybean crop. So grazing it in the spring is something to consider. I think your decision points there are pre-plant. Am I going to manage this for high forage? That affects the seed rate. Late April, that's the point where you can still kill it if you're trying to save moisture. And then in late May, after the rye, you can decide whether you want to go with soybeans or forage sorghum. In a drought situation, we've seen the yield of the soybeans crop will be about half with the rye cover crop versus without. So in a good year, you can have your cake and eat it too. If you got moisture, you can have the rye, and you can get a nice soybean crop. And but in a drought year, that rye cover crop will use moisture the soybeans needed. Now I'm just going to skip this for time. Fall grazing, we grazed rye for grain in the fall, and in the next year, we couldn't see where we grazed and where we hadn't. The grazed yielded 93.6 bushel per acre. This is hybrid rye. Ungrazed yielded 93.8 bushel per acre. So it looks like fall grazing is might be an option for people with cattle. These cattle went on here in late November and came off in December, and we grazed it hard. But the next year, by the time it headed out, you couldn't tell where that was. That rye would have been planted. That was in 2021. We had moisture. It was planted, I think, September 23rd, if I remember right, after an early soybean. All right, I better skip along here since I'm out of time. The point I wanted to make with this graph is that the hybrid rye yields about 30 bushel per acre better than open pollinated rye. So it's expensive, but there's a 30 bushel per acre average yield gain with it. And it's very competitive with weeds. And I'll just point out, this was some trial that David Karki and I did some years ago. 2013, we had a year with good moisture. This is weed biomass. In an organic system, we had 1,100 pounds of weed biomass under the wheat. We had 20 pounds under the rye. So I think as time goes along, especially we're dealing with herbicide resistance and weeds, I think this rye has a place. You'll have to ask me about the managing it. The last point I wanted to make is the big thing is going to be the market. And we're doing work as a feed grain, and it looks like it has a fit early in the cycle. So we really want to watch this. If you're thinking about raising hybrid rye, I would say agronomically it's a very tough crop. It's high yielding. It's competitive with weeds. It doesn't get sick easy. It's got a lot of pluses. But you have to think through the market. And hopefully this takes off as a feed grain. It looks promising. We're going to have workshop in Brandon February 15th and one in Wagner on February 16th. It'll just be devoted to rye. So if you're interested in that, you might take that in. I think Sarah's going to set it up so it'll be available in a webinar. And there's flyers at the booth. So if you really, I'm using up Sarah's goodwill here. So if you're interested in the rye, though, there'll be some things going on in mid-February, and talk to Sarah, and she can set you up. And if you can't get to Wagner, she can get you there on a webinar. I better quit. Thank you all. All right.
Thank you so much, Pete. I think that there is just a lot of takeaways. It's kind of like drinking from a fire hose again. That's this entire meeting. But one of the big things that Pete's really been working on is rye, looking at open pollinated and hybrid rye, as you heard. So there's a lot of research at the Southeast Farm going on, and all of these topics, you can find that information in their yearly report, which is online. You can ask one of us to help you find it, or we can email it to you. They also print it. So all of that data that he's discussing basically is in that Southeast Research Farm report. Pete, we really appreciate your time, and I know we're always pushing on time, but I think we could talk about these things forever. We'll take, in between speakers here, maybe one question if there's someone has it. Otherwise, Pete will be around, I assume, for the rest of the day or part of the day. Yeah, Pete will be here. So if anyone has a question to ask real quick, we can take that, and then I'll give you a few announcements. Thank you so much, Pete.
Thank you, Sarah.
There's one question.
If we're early on in the adaptation of cover crops into our operation, are we better off working with low fiber, high protein cover crops then?
Yes, I would say if you're just early transitioning, I would stay away from the high residue ones, just because you're trying to get the microbial community built up to break down residue. And really, we've done more trials than I showed here, and the corn does well after a brassica-based cover crop mix. Just been our experience, unless you're in a drought. So I don't want to say that's universal. If you're in a drought, that's a different kettle of fish. But that would be the place to start especially if you're struggling with too much residue.
Thank you so much, Pete. And again, you can catch him here for the rest of the day if you've got more questions. So we appreciate it. Thank you, Peter.